Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're going to get started here right at 7:01, as is our tradition. We always like to give everyone a minute to log on to Zoom. You know how it goes when your phone buzzes at you that you need to do something and then you have to rush to the right device. You have to possibly update said application on said device. So we give everyone like a 1 or 2 minute grace period before we get started. How's it going, Karan?
Doing all right, Jim. How are you?
Very good. Very good. Have you done any more fantasy football drafts since we last spoke about it?
I had one more yesterday, so it actually overlapped with the webinar. So I had both open.
That's funny.
How about you?
Not yet. No, my other two leagues are super late. We'll be doing it like early next week. So, yeah. The
Go for
family
it.
leagues, you know how it is when the youngest sibling in the family runs the family league. Always late. Always.
Fair, fair.
Not late, but right on time, last
Right
minute.
on time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure
Hey,
we can get
avoid any
some.
last minute injuries.
Yeah, true, true. You get to avoid all the training camp injuries. All right, well, enough of a mini sermon on fantasy football for the year. It's 7:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome in everyone to our back to school webinar for sophomores. I know some people in here would have started school already by now, possibly as early as yesterday or even earlier, depending on where in the country you are. And others are starting after Labor Day. It's a really exciting time of year because you get to sort of look ahead. Now, of course, if you're in our webinar, what you're typically concerned with is kind of maximizing college admissions chances. And when it comes to maximizing college admissions chances, we really encourage students and families to focus on what's actually in your control. I say that because there's a whole lot in this process that is outside of your control. Things like what other students at your high school are doing, your demographic information, all of those things can factor into your eventual college admissions. But for a student who wants to put their time and energy toward improving their chances, the best 5 things to do that in are on this slide. And we sort of use this as a guiding principle as we sort of shepherd families through what they need to be thinking about at various points in the process. We'll kick that off with Karan talking to us about grades and academic rigor.
So thanks, Jim. So in starting with grades and rigor, and the reason we do this, it is because it is by far of the 5 factors that are in your student's control, they're going to be the most important. You can kind of think of your grades and kind of the student's transcript as the front page of the student's application, right? Your name will be on there, your address, that sort of thing. But fundamentally, colleges are looking for people and students who will be able to handle the academic rigor once they get to the school. And so they want to see that students challenge themselves in high school, but also performed well in the classes that they were taking. So all of your students are going to be entering sophomore year this year, and maybe freshman year didn't go as well as they wanted, right? Maybe there's a couple lower grades in there than what they expected. The transition to high school was a little bit different. Well, the idea this year is going to be is setting up yourself so that the whole year goes well, right? You want to make sure that even if you were a little bit lower than you wanted to be in your freshman year, during your sophomore year, you're really moving on that upward trajectory. With that being said, how you do in your sophomore year will also affect how and what classes your teachers recommend you for when you go into your junior year. Junior year grades are going to be by far the most important for your student's application just because it's going to be the last full year that your student is going to be able to show a college, right? While colleges will see a little bit of the start of their senior year, what classes they're taking, how they did in maybe the first quarter, first half of the year, depending on if you're applying early or regular decision, it comes down to junior year is the last one where they can see the full picture, right? And so while junior year grades are the most important. We do want to make sure that we focus on the sophomore year grades as well. So with that being said, why do we really want to care about this? So over the past couple of years, this chart goes all the way back to the 1960s. You can see that the percentage of students at four-year universities, so shooting for the bachelor's degree, has gone steadily upward as grade inflation has become more rampant in high schools, right? So back in the 1960s, you can see it's less than 25% of students getting straight A's. Now, when you look at the students who are freshmen at four-year universities, you're looking at almost over 65%, right? And so for these students, like the grades are truly the most important thing. And like, if you did struggle in your freshman year, if you have a little bit of struggles at the start of your sophomore year, you want to make sure you address those early in your sophomore year so you can make sure that you set yourself up for a good foundation. Because while this upward trajectory is for all colleges, let's show you an example of a particular school, right? So this is for our Pennsylvania families or any families that are interested, the University of Pittsburgh. So the University of Pittsburgh, this is for students that are actually enrolled in the program, 60 into their freshman year, excuse me. 67% of them had a GPA of 4.0. And the average GPA of like people who were submitted their GPA 4.13, right? And so with those numbers, you can see that a lot of students are getting straight A's. And in fact, a lot of students are even averaging above an A, right? So this may include A pluses in certain classes. This may include some weighting that students get for taking an honors class and an AP class. One context with the weighting of GPAs, don't worry too much about how your own high school weights a GPA. Each college standardizes it on their own. So for example, if your school gives an extra point for an AP class, but only half a point for an honors, the college is going to look at that and kind of throw that weighted GPA out the window and kind of look at either the numerical grades or the letter grades the students got and calculate their own GPA from there. So with these numbers, as you can see, though, 67% have straight A's or even a little bit above, right? And so even with the 3.7 to 3.99, you're looking at almost 80% of students that are averaging over an A minus.
And if I can make one quick note about the data here. So Pitt uses a weighted GPA. There are also colleges out there that use unweighted GPAs. There might be some colleges that are more selective, harder to get into than the University of Pittsburgh, but it looks like their average GPA is lower because they're not giving students that extra bump for honors in AP and IB courses. So that's just something you always want to keep in mind to contextualize whenever you're looking at any college GPA data.
And actually, one more thing with that too, Jim, is that different colleges weigh things differently, right? So some school may have a cutoff at 2 APs or 5 APs and how they weight things. And so every college is going to be a little bit different in that as well. But you can kind of look at the overall numbers to get an idea of where you're at, whether your student's going to be a competitive applicant at a particular college. So with that being said, in terms of sophomore year, right? Like we want to make sure that we're showing that improvement. Now, if your student did get those great grades that freshman year, they set themselves with a great foundation for their high school transcript, they need to continue keeping that going. But if the student did struggle a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, we do want to see that upward trajectory. In terms of picking your classes and things like that, I mentioned that it'll affect the recommendations your teachers give. This will be particularly important on the math side of things. If your student is looking at a STEM major, so science, tech, engineering, math, that sort of thing, a lot of those colleges do want to see the students taking calculus by their senior year of high school because they'll be entering basically calculus 2 when they get to college. And so they want to make sure that the students are academically ready and don't need to kind of take those remedial classes or summer classes to try to catch up for that. So course selection. So everyone chose their courses at some point in their freshman year. It was probably right around midterm time, maybe a little bit later. Some schools do March or April. But with that being said, course selection is really going to matter, especially as we get halfway through this year. So you want to make sure you're choosing the right classes. So part of it is reassessing how this year has gone, right? Say sophomore year has gone really well. You said you felt like, hey, it was easy. I had a lot of free time on my hands. The rigor wasn't that difficult. Challenge yourself with a couple more honors classes, AP classes, IB classes. Maybe consider the IB curriculum. If you were in a position where you were really struggling or there was one class that was kind of holding you back and really taking a lot out of you, maybe that's one you don't choose an honors or AP class, right? So every student is different and is a little bit subjective in terms of what the exact right answer for each student is, right? But it's also important to keep in mind that like making sure you set yourself up for junior year is going to doing well in junior year is important. On with the last little thing with that, if you're looking at those top tier universities, right? If in your US News and World Report, top 25, top 50 schools, they're going to want to see you taking the most challenging courses. So it's not one of those things where you can decide not to take any honors or AP classes and kind of avoid that. If your school does not have honors classes, if your school only has a couple AP classes, that won't be held against you. High schools provide that information to colleges so that the colleges know what courses were available to your student. So there are a lot of schools where maybe an honors class is at the level of AP class where they just don't have honors or AP classes. Don't worry about it. That won't be held against your student. So what can we do right now, right? We talked about course selection halfway through the year. Let's reassess how we did last year. So if things went well, continue to do that, right? Like how did your finals go in that year? This year, if you're taking finals, some of your students might in their sophomore year be taking some AP classes, a couple common ones, or computer science and things like that. And they're going to have to study for those throughout the year. So look ahead not only to the final, but the AP and have a schedule for that as you work through the year. Make sure you understand the subjects. If you know that you're struggling, you're able to identify that you're struggling early on, do something about it, right? So this could be reaching out to a teacher, creating a study group, figuring out a way to potentially get extra credit, right? And figuring out what you need to do in that particular class to improve your performance. If for some reason that like those things don't work and we realize that within the next couple of months, like you're better off dropping down to a class that's more appropriate for the student's academic level or academic ability in that subject, just because you don't want one bad performance in one class to kind of affect your performance in a lot of the other classes that you're taking. And then Jim, you want to take it away with kind of the tutoring a little bit?
Yeah, so once you've done the sort of interventions that are easy to take, like asking a teacher for extra help, asking your friends to form a study group and do some kind of communal studying. By the way, study groups are not just for the students who need help. One of the things that I always did in high school, I started tutoring in 8th grade. Teaching material to my friends was my way to study for finals because, it's true that you learn something better by teaching it than any other way. So I really recommend, even if you are not that student who's struggling, reach out to your friends who you might see struggling because it'll be much easier for you to prepare for those exams as well. Now, if you've tried those other interventions and it's just not working, that's when you reach out and you think about getting tutoring assistance. So when we work with students on school subjects, we want to help them, find out to what extent do we need to focus on the content at hand, and to what extent do we need to focus on building study skills and habits for the future. So, while we do test prep that's separate from school subject tutoring, like math help and things like that, at the same time, we want to know, what do your math tests look like? How are you actually going to need to reproduce this information for your teacher? If you're taking, an AP social studies course, are you getting essay questions in the format they're going to be on the AP exam? And to what extent do we need to prepare for the format of your tests while we're helping you master that content? So we're always looking to find that balancing act between how much do we need to help you with the material and how much do we need to help you optimize the way you're reproducing that for a grade, right? And it's always going to be a balancing act between the two. Either way, it's a lot easier to keep up with tutoring than to catch up with tutoring. Of course, if you find yourself behind and you need us, give us a call. We're happy to help. But trust me, it's a much more comfortable experience to reach out when you're a little confused before you get that bad grade on the first test. Our phone will ring off the hook like the first week in October when everyone gets their first unit test back in math in particular, for a lot of students who want tutoring help. And the ones who are self-aware enough to realize that they're having trouble keeping up before then don't have to spend the whole rest of the marking period recovering from that grade. So really recommend reaching out sooner rather than later, trying everything at your disposal to stay on track instead of trying to catch up later.
So moving to one of the more objective factors, right? Your grades and kind of your performance in your classes to one of the more subjective ones. So letters of recommendation, colleges want them because they get an insight to see what the student is like in the classroom, right? They get to know more about their personality, their learning style, that sort of thing. The two people that are going to be writing letters of recommendations for your students are going to be your teachers and their guidance counselor, their college counselor. It's different at every school. If you're a little bit confused, talk to whoever is probably handling your course selection for your student, and they can either guide you in the right direction or they might be the individual who is going to be writing that recommendation. So what sorts of recommendations are students going to need? So every student is going to have one of those recommendations from a counselor, right? Whether it be a guidance counselor, college counselor, that sort of thing. So with that being said, make sure the student builds a relationship with that person. A lot of times, especially at public schools, the counselor might have up to 100, 200 kids that they're working with, right? And so this doesn't mean your student needs to go in and meet with the counselor every week, every month. Just keep them in the loop as you're progressing through things, right? So maybe you visited some colleges and you're interested, like you found what maybe the type of school you're interested in. Maybe there's a couple majors that you're considering. And so when it gets to course selection time, you may ask them about certain courses at your school that might be beneficial to take, right? So build that relationship so they have that rapport with you so that when they write that recommendation, it's just not a reiteration of your resume, your grades. It's something truly personal, and admissions officers can really see that. So with that, most colleges are also going to require one or two teachers. Two is very common. Some colleges require one. With that, they want core subject teachers. So what is a core subject? Math, science, history, English, and foreign language. And so ideally, it's going to be junior year teachers. We'll get into a little bit of those exceptions in a second, but ideally it's junior year teachers. Why is that important to talk about in your sophomore year? Maybe in your junior year, you don't develop that great relationship with a teacher, right? Maybe you don't have that great rapport with the teacher. Then you may come back and talk to your 10th grade teachers as potential recommenders, right? And so in that situation, this is the year especially to start learning to talk to your teachers, reaching out if you need help, right? Sometimes if you excel in a course, that might not be the teacher that got to know you the best because the things just came naturally to you, right? But the teacher you did have to ask for help, the teacher that you did go to tutoring with or maybe checked in with during lunchtime, right? They got to see a little bit more of your personality, and that teacher might actually end up being a recommender. You want someone who's going to know and love you the most. In terms of extra recommenders, a lot of times people ask about an external coach outside of the minimum or like the amount this college requires. Unless there's an extremely compelling reason for those extra recommendations, most of the time the colleges are not going to want to see an additional recommendation. Admissions officers go through enough applications on their own. They ask for what they want for specific reasons. And so adding the additional stuff, they either might not look at it or they might actually find it as a negative for your application as you're adding more unnecessary information into it. So with that said, Jim, do you want to quickly tell your story about the teacher that you asked?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm one of the people who did use the optional extra letter of recommendation beyond the required. And the main reason I did it is because my core extracurricular activity in high school was track and field. And I was a late bloomer. I was, the second highest scorer on the team senior year for spring sports. That doesn't count for college. So I just had 3 years of nothing but JV on my resume when I was applying to college. But my head track and field coach was also my social studies teacher. Now, he was teaching world history, and I wanted to study, among other things, classics and philosophy. So it was a teacher who was taught a course, even though it's freshman year, typically freshman year use not all that similar to the person who walks onto a college campus, which is why those teachers aren't great to ask. And typically you're not asking a sports coach, you're asking teachers. But because my sort of extracurricular resume was lacking a lot of context because I was in leadership positions on that track and field team. I was running the timing system for our meets. I actually coached our shot put and discus throwers one season when we didn't have a coach. And the head coach could really speak to this because he knew I was someone he could trust and lean on the biggest sports team at the whole school. So where the coaches kind of needed deputies in a way. So he was able to speak to something that wouldn't be able to show up anywhere else in my application. And if I just talk about how great I am at track and field, but all it says is JV, 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 it doesn't land the same way to an admissions officer. So because of those combination reasons, I used him as an additional recommender after my two core junior subject teachers at the same time.
So when should students ask, right? I know we mentioned junior year teachers, but if your student has a teacher in their sophomore year that they're thinking about potentially asking, right? Have that conversation with the teacher this year. The teacher's not going to be writing that recommendation for until a full year from then, but just know if they're going to say yes, right? Just know if it's going to be a potential option for your student. With that being said, most students typically ask students in their junior year at the end of their junior year. Do it while school is still going on for a couple of reasons. One, it gives them the entire summer to write their recommendation, right? Just like the students, the teachers aren't in school all day. So they'll have that opportunity to do that. Furthermore, some teachers cap how many recommendations they're going to write, right? Some teachers may only write 10 or 20 for different students because they truly want to put the full effort into those recommendations. And so you want to make sure that you're able to ask the teachers that you truly want, and you're not a student who asks them after they've hit their cap, right? So if someone has said yes and you don't hear back, or you've asked and haven't heard back, like, start to reach out again and make sure that like you get that the definitive yes from a teacher before you just assume that it's going to get done. So how should your students ask, right? So with that said, they should always ask in person. Always meet the teacher in their classroom during a school day. Find time after school to go meet with the teacher. Always ask in person. With that said, after you do that, follow up by email, right? Thank you. Thank them for taking the time, how you appreciate them. Talk about your personal connection with them a little bit. Also, give them a little bit of context of what they're actually doing for you, right? If you know some of your college and when you're going to be applying, you should tell them about the deadlines for those schools. A brag sheet, I'll get to that in a second, but if you have a brag sheet already, send that to the teacher, right? Because a teacher may say, I've seen you do excellent things in the classroom, but some context outside the classroom, things you've done in terms of extracurriculars, things like that might be valuable. If you especially are in a class where, let's just say it's a STEM class and you're part of the robotics club, right? How you've taken that stuff to what you've learned to the robotics club could be really valuable. So that's where the brag sheet comes from. And then finally, just thank them, right? They're taking time out of their days, out of their summers, to do something nice for you. And fundamentally, like, they don't have to, right? No teacher is required to write those recommendations. And make sure you show your gratitude. Now, just real quick, going back to what a brag sheet is. So a brag sheet is basically it's somewhat like a resume. It talks about your accomplishments, skills, things like that, that give a little bit more context to either the counselor or the teacher about you, right? And so for your counselor, it might talk a little bit more about your extracurriculars and things like that, which they never see. Some schools will have a brag sheet that they ask the students to fill out, so they have an actual template that you'll be working off of. If not, it's just always good to put together everything, keep track of everything. Oftentimes when we meet with students and we're talking about essays, or we're talking about course selection for next year, or even extracurricular activities, students forget what they did, right? But parents will remember the awards they won and the things that they drove them to, especially in 9th and 10th grade, when they're not at the top of the mind for the student, right? And so start writing those things down now early so you don't miss out on those.
Great. So now we get to my favorite part of the conversation, and arguably everyone else's least favorite part, which is standardized testing. I want to take right now as a great opportunity to remind you about the Zoom Q&A feature. Please drop any questions you have into the Q&A. In last year's junior presentation, when we got to standardized tests, is when the questions really started to rain in. So I just want to remind you all, please do. You all know you need great grades. You all know, yeah, suck up to your teachers. That stuff has been mostly straightforward. We hope you learned some new insights into how it all works. But standardized testing is going to be pretty new when we're talking from the college admissions standpoint for rising 10th graders. It's a big year for it because many of you will take the PSAT in October if your school offers it. And if not, you'll start to do your first practice test to make a plan. So I want to just upfront say, this isn't about taking the SAT tomorrow or something like that. But sophomore year is the year that you start to think about what your plan will be, because you're going to execute on that, before and during your junior year. Now, I like to start the conversation here, especially in light of nowadays most colleges having optional test scores, with how colleges actually use these scores in the first place. So the number one reason that colleges use test scores is to predict student success at a college. Karan alluded to this in the conversation about grades. They want to see what students can show up on campus and keep up with the academic rigor. Karan also showed us some data on grade inflation, showing that actually A's tell a college less than they have in the past because more students have A's. So because colleges can't rely solely on grades as a predictor of which students will be successful, that's where standardized testing comes into play. Now, standardized testing, no one believes that a number tells the story of a student. It's one factor in a holistic review process. And one of the things it can do is compare you with your local context. So what we mean by that is colleges get with your transcript something called a school profile from your high school. Karan alluded to this when he mentioned that colleges have information about what AP courses are offered at your school, for instance. That'll be part of the school profile. So too will data on the percentage of students at your high school that go to a four-year college, the percentage of, students that take the SAT or ACT and the average scores there. So colleges can see, what students of a similar background to you are doing and how you compare to that. All of this can be relevant. When we talk about standardized testing, parents who are, here with a sophomore as their oldest child or with much older children are not quite used to the sort of post-pandemic landscape of most colleges being test optional. And that's where we are now. Fewer than 10% are requiring scores, fewer than 10% aren't using them at all. And that over 80% in the middle are test optional. And I'll be digging into what that really means on the next slide. You also have colleges that have gone back to requiring test scores. So largely these fall into the buckets of big Southern state schools, University of Georgia, Florida State System, University of Tennessee. Some of the schools in Alabama, like Alabama and Auburn, are sort of functionally test required, but not quite. And then many of the most selective schools in the country. MIT, half of the Ivy League schools last spring reinstated the requirement, Georgetown, etc. Now, that's not to say every large Southern state school requires testing, and it's not to say every very competitive school requires testing. But those are sort of the most common categories. So if you know there are going to be a lot of those schools on your list, then you need to proceed as if testing is going to be a requirement. Then finally, we have schools that are test blind or score free. You'll see both terms. The University of California system is most popular with our students among the test blind schools. So that would include UCLA and Berkeley, for instance. And these schools, you can send them a test score and they won't even look at it. So you can try to sneak it into the additional information section. They truly have decided it's not part of their process and they're not going to look at it or consider it at all. Now, test optional, what it strictly speaking means is that a college will accept your application fee, process your application if it has a test score on it or not. Of course, it doesn't say anything about your chances of being admitted. And test optional can mean very different things at different schools. So you essentially have some schools that are test optional, like Duke or Penn, but over 70% of their admitted students are submitting test scores. So how optional is it really at a place like that? On the other hand, you have other schools that are admitting fewer than 40% of their students with test scores, which sends a strong message that to them, the test score is not that important of a factor. That's more of a West Coast thing. So you'll see University of Washington and Pepperdine here. But as something local to the Philadelphia area where many of our families are based, Temple would be an example of a school that is very test optional. Most schools are going to fall somewhere in the middle there, which means essentially that a strong score is going to be an asset to your application, but it's not strictly necessary for your admission. The more selective your goals are, the more important it's going to be to have that strong test score. And that's essentially just because there's less to distinguish the students with the best resumes, so to speak, the best applications. The strongest applications, you just want every little factor in your favor to help you distinguish yourself. Having the strong score is going to expand your options in two main ways. One is college choice, and that's because it opens you up to schools that are test required and schools that are nearly test required. And then also for merit scholarships, there are many schools out there that are test optional, but still require test scores for scholarships. and it might just be for some of their scholarships, it might be for all. Pepperdine, one of the examples I gave, they admit 29% of their students with test scores, very test optional school. But their best merit scholarship requires a test score. In some of the large southern state schools, which have become a lot more popular with students in the Northeast lately, they publish what we call a merit grid, which shows you exactly how much money per year you'll get if you have a certain SAT or ACT score and a certain GPA. We love these merit grids because it means families can invest money with us and we can actually make them money. Everybody wins. It's one of our favorite things to do with our students when we know that they're targeting one of those schools and they can make thousands of dollars a year by studying. What a great opportunity, quit the job at Panera at that point and really go in on, studying because your hourly is going to be a whole lot better if you get that scholarship. The last point here is really important to note, which is if the amount of time and effort and stress it would take for you to get that strong standardized test score would require an undue, commitment from you where you're taking away from your ability to do your best in your classes, to commit yourself to strong extracurricular activities that Karan's going to talk about in a minute. If you're struggling in those areas as a result of trying to get better at these tests, that's when you really consider going test optional. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, we have two options for standardized testing, the SAT and ACT. When we talk about the timeline for when to take those tests, your timeline is basically going to be dictated by three main factors. One is when you completed Algebra 2 or geometry. In other words, if you're completing Algebra 2 or geometry, whichever of the two is second, that is, or the equivalent course in an integrated math curriculum, you want to have finished that course or be close to finishing that course when you take the test for the first time. That means if you're taking it in 10th grade, you have flexibility to test whenever you want junior year. And typically we recommend doing it earlier, mainly because of these other factors. Mental health and workload management and extracurricular and real life schedule that make it a lot harder to test for the first time in the spring of junior year, which most students will tell you is the most academically intense time of high school. If you are finishing Algebra 2 or geometry or the equivalent integrated math course during 11th grade, though, then you're best off testing in the spring because you're going to learn things in the course of your math class that are going to be absolutely essential for the test. So that's something to keep in mind when we speak broadly about a testing plan. Now, the dates you'll be able to take these tests. So what I've highlighted here is just in yellow are the dates I would recommend for students who have finished with that math and are on the earlier time frame taking it for the first time in 11th grade. And in pink, the dates that I would recommend taking it for the first time if you are taking that Algebra 2 geometry equivalent course during junior year. So this is the kind of time frame to be considering. Of course, with picking out test dates and timelines, there's a lot that goes into it. If you go to summer camp every year, no, you shouldn't quit summer camp to do test prep. We would never tell you to do that. We're going to work with you on when you should start based on what is going on in your life. And that is something we do. That's why we have that link there in the corner of my screen. If you ever want to talk about timing for a test prep plan, that's what I'm here for all of our families. People often ask what SAT and ACT test dates have the easiest curve. The answer is none. And what we mean by that is that the curves of the SAT and ACT are predicted. They're not actually based on a student's performance on test day. So it's not like a college calculus course where everyone takes the test in the same room and only, a handful of people in that room are walking out with an A. That's not how it works. So it doesn't matter if seniors are taking it at the same time. It's based on a hypothetical population of combined juniors and seniors, because that's the population that mostly takes the real SAT. There are easier and harder curves on the test, but they vary throughout the year. And honestly, even more important than that is how that individual variation gels with you. So in other words, some SATs might have 9 vocab questions, others might have 11. If vocab is one of the things you struggle the most with, then you'd be really happy to see 9 vocab questions. Well, you have no way of knowing before you sit down for that SAT if it's going to be 9, 11, or 10, right? And so that variation and how it maps onto your strengths is often even more important than kind of what the curve is of the test. So for that reason, we recommend planning upfront to test more than once, just because it typically makes your life easier in the long run and your results stronger. When we talk about these two tests, we have essentially two options. The first is the digital SAT. And the digital SAT is out of 1600 with 800 each in reading and writing and math. And each of those sections is broken down into two modules, a first and a second. Relative to the ACT, the biggest challenges our students tend to report on the digital SAT is that the annotation tools are limited. The ACT is a test you can still take on paper, and so, you can annotate it in any way you want. A Dixon Ticonderoga pencil, number 2, can do kind of anything, right? But in an application on a computer, you can annotate it according to the way that the application allows you. There are some very cool annotation tools for the digital SAT that we teach our students to use, but they're not unlimited the way that a pencil and paper are. The verbal questions of the SAT, most students will report, are more challenging. Passages will be older in terms of publication date. You'll see things from the 1800s quite regularly. You'll see poetry on the SAT, but not on the ACT. And the level of the passage tends to be more challenging, even though the passages are shorter. Most students will tell you it's harder to comprehend some of the hardest SAT passages than it is for their ACT counterparts. Finally, adaptive scoring. So the SAT uses something called adaptive scoring. And this is not so much a challenge in the sense that it makes the test objectively harder. It's a challenge in the sense that it often weighs on students' minds. In other words, it messes with your head more than it really affects your ability to do well. And so every student on an SAT, reading and writing or math, they both work the same way. They'll start with module 1 of a standard difficulty. And then that will feed them into, based on their performance, a higher scoring module 2, which is more difficult, or a lower scoring module 2, which is less difficult. And that will feed you into the appropriate place on the final scoring curve. Now, you can overlap between the two modules, meaning a very strong low module 2 performance would be stronger than a very poor high module 2 performance. So it's not exact to like kind of where you're being spat out. And it matters too which questions you missed along the way, because the SAT has variable weights to the questions. So the scoring of the SAT is more of a sort of black box and more mysterious than it is on the SAT. At the end of the day, as a student, what you should be focused on and getting ready for it is getting better at the questions that it asks. So in other words, getting better at the test isn't any more challenging. It's just that, this is sort of an added distraction, and it does really distract some students. For the ACT is undergoing changes. So parents or students who have older siblings may have heard about the classic ACT. The classic ACT was 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science, with an optional writing section. No one should ever take the writing section. That's the last thing I'm going to say about the writing section, and we'll talk about the rest now. But don't sign up for it. It used to be that only West Point required it. Now they've even gotten rid of the requirement. So it's really just not necessary to take it all. The new ACT is going to have both paper or digital options, and it's going to be English, math, and reading, factoring into your composite score, your overall score. Science is going to be an optional score on the side. Now, with this new test, science is listed as optional by ACT. No college has come out and said it's optional. And in fact, the only data point we have of an ACT using entity reporting what it's going to do about the science section is that the Bright Futures Scholarship Program in Florida, which, if we have any Florida clients in here, everyone knows about Bright Futures. It is, something you qualify for, again, based on test scores and GPA. So we work with a lot of students who are going for that number on the SAT or the ACT. And Bright Futures is going to still use the science score in calculating that score. So that means in the state of Florida, we know that science is not optional at all. We don't know about the rest of the country because colleges haven't said anything yet. But that's important to keep in mind. The scoring of the ACT, very different if you're used to SAT from growing up. The scoring of the ACT is out of 36. Each section is out of 36, and then they're averaged together. In the new version, only the 3 mandatory sections are going to be averaged together for your score out of 36, and science will be a score on the side out of 36. Again, unless you're applying to Bright Futures, then they're going to do the math their own way. which is kind of what we expect colleges to do to some extent anyway. Karan already mentioned that's what they do with your weighted GPA, right? So they have systems in place that already pull your information and recompute it the way they like. The biggest challenges of the ACT relative to the SAT are timing and fatigue. The current version of the ACT, which sophomores, you won't take at all, because the changes are going to be fully in effect by September of your junior year, which would be the first time most of you will test. Um, it it's a longer test, much longer than the SAT. And with the science section, it'll still be longer than the SAT, and you have more questions to do in the time that you're allotted. So you have less time per question, which can make it a more exhausting experience. Even if you are being more accurate and getting a higher score on the ACT, we often have students say that they felt worse taking the ACT than the SAT, even if they score in some cases 50 to 100 SAT points higher in their equivalent ACT score. So that's kind of the big difference between the two. I've just given you a bunch of information, and no doubt you're thinking, like, how do I actually make this decision now that you've told me about them? The answer is try both tests and compare the scores. For about half of students, one of the scores is going to be much stronger than the other just because the style of test gels better with the way that your brain works. And if that's the case, take that lead and run with it. Your starting score is, part of it's what you're improving from. So if you make the same improvement from a stronger starting score, you're going to have a stronger ending score. If your scores are similar, then we'll typically look at a couple different factors here. Where are your strengths and weaknesses, and how do we typically see students improve in those areas? Or we'll look at, how does the test date schedule work for you? Which one did you prefer taking? These are all things that we will consider in that kind of decision between SAT or ACT. The best time to do diagnostic testing is by the end of 10th grade or the beginning of 11th grade. If you are advanced enough in math, then often if you took that sophomore year PSAT, taking a practice ACT at that point, because you already have your SAT data point, is a great idea because then you get an apples to apples comparison. If you want to use that PSAT in the fall as your SAT benchmark, then that ACT should really be completed by like the end of winter break because you're learning and growing throughout 10th grade. And you should be better at this kind of test in the spring than you were in the fall, right? If school and biology are doing their respective jobs in making you smarter. So for that reason, we recommend just making sure that those two tests are similar in time frame. If you are on that later math track and planning to test for the first time in the spring of 11th grade, then that's the time you'd probably want to wait until your junior year PSAT and take a practice ACT then. And then you can compare those two and make your plan for the spring. So that's typically what we recommend. We also offer free diagnostic testing to anyone. So maybe your school doesn't offer the PSAT, or maybe you just can't make it that day. Maybe you get the flu at the wrong time, right? If you miss it for any reason, we can give you options for diagnostic testing at home, where as long as you take those two tests in the same environment, take them seriously as tests, no distractions, no phone, all that good stuff, then we can compare those scores and use them to compare so that we'll be able to, focus you in on the test that's going to get you the best results. If you do any kind of diagnostic testing through us, and we're going to offer a planning call to, talk through your student's plan based on the results and based on kind of what's going on in their life and their schedule. I see from our attendee list that some of you have had those calls with me in the past. Hi, everybody. That's kind of my main role here at Ivy Experience, is working with families on their test prep plans. The inevitable question comes up. This is one of our perennial questions, so we decided to just make it a slide. Can I just take both? It seems like I should just try both and see which one I do better on, like as in take both officially. The answer is yeah, there's no harm in it. You don't have to send the results of the worst one to your colleges if you don't want to share that with them. But when you're talking about investing time and money into test prep, you should really focus that in one direction. That is going to be your best way to get the strongest return on the investment for the vast majority of students. There can be exceptions. One of the notable ones is students who are capable of scoring very high on either one of these tests. Often it's just a matter of having your best day on the right day. And so if you want to try both versions and then submit the one that you like better, go for it. Thanks for your immense patience, everyone, getting through the standardized testing stuff. We now return to fun activities.
Yeah. So going into the fun activities, and that's going to kind of be the theme of what we talked about in these extracurricular activities, is why are extracurricular activities important? They're going to show what the student is passionate about outside of the classroom. And there might be some correlation to inside of the classroom as well, right? This is where we truly get to know the student, what their personality is like, what their interests are like, how they spend their time when they're not stuck in school from 7:30 to 2:30 or 8:30 to 3:30, right? And so what are they choosing to do with their time that's going to be productive and allow them to pursue their interests? So with that said, what sort of extracurricular activities should students focus on? So first of all, don't worry about what looks best on a college application, right? That'll naturally come if a student pursues activities that they're passionate about. So there's kind of two main categories that we kind of see these extracurricular activities. One is truly on the students' passions, right? This could be art, music, things that they may not be pursuing in the classroom or may not be pursuing in their high school classes, but that they really care about, right? Sports, that sort of thing, community service, where they need to figure out the activities that are important to them. That's not saying don't do extra volunteer work. That's not to say don't help out a community organization. It's to say that the ones that you are truly passionate about, spend the time in doing them, right? As you pursue an activity for longer, you'll get better at it. Your student will get better at it. And over time, they might develop a leadership position, which is something colleges like to see. They might be able to expand an organization or help with an extra cleanup for a community service organization that was not there before, right? So those initiatives by the student can come once they're focusing on an activity that they're already passionate about. With that said, the other category is kind of the more academically inclined activities, right? Say a student has an interest in computer science or math or something like that. Maybe they're pursuing a robotics club. If they're interested in political science, international relations, they may join Model UN or the debate team, right? And so in those moments, the students kind of have those two areas, both what they think they want to academically focus on and the things that they enjoy doing, right? So those are the activities that you really want your student to pursue if they are not already in their sophomore year, right? And an authentic application, a student that makes sense, right? We look at an application, when we talk to students in our advising meetings and we talk about what activities they're doing, especially the ones about like junior year course selection, usually you get a fair idea of what the students like, right? They may like a particular sport and therefore they're playing that sport, but also teaching it or working at a camp for that. They're particularly passionate about their religious beliefs, right? So they might be working at the Sunday school or something along those lines, or maybe volunteering at their church or synagogue or things like that. And so figuring out what those passions are, what those interests are, and pursuing in them the best way the student can will naturally make your college application better and more authentic to the student. So how can they actually going about doing that? The first is, if in their ninth grade year they didn't really pursue much, this is the time to really get started with that, right? In those first couple of weeks of school, start joining some clubs, some activities, right? Just because you go to the first meeting or the first two meetings of a club doesn't mean you have to join for the entire year. So if your student hasn't done any extracurricular activities yet, the school activities are kind of a good place to start. Look over, a lot of schools on their website will have what extracurricular activities available. Look over that list and see what opportunities are available to your students, right? But as we get into 10th grade and as they move along with their activities, your student did take a lot on their freshman year. This is the year where you really want to focus in and get deeper, right? Well, that doesn't mean you have to quit any clubs. It just means that focusing on the clubs where you're really passionate, right? Doesn't mean to like leave one, but also at the same time, like pursue maybe a leadership position if there is one. Take more initiative so the older students who are in those clubs see you taking that initiative and maybe get you more involved so you're more lined up for a leadership position later on. Maybe you're practicing a little harder, doing more outside of the organization itself to get better at a particular skill. Now, with that said, you're not limited to the school clubs, right? So say your student is in some clubs already, or maybe they're just not the right fit scheduling wise, things like that, right? Like figure out what other opportunities are available in your area. A lot of times your students will turn 16 for the first time. In a lot of states, that's when you can first start working, right? So if getting a job is something of interest of them, get a job. It's going to show more responsibility than any particular club in the school most probably will, right? Someone's actually paying your student to be there. Most clubs in school are not going to kick the student out as long as they continue to show up, right? And so that level of responsibility a job shows, particularly if it's one where they stick with it for a couple years, right? They might start at kind of a very low level position, but let's just take a grocery store. You might start off stocking shelves, but you may move on to a cashier or a customer service position, maybe opening with open and close, right? And those built-on abilities can be, and even a lot of times are more valuable than some of the maybe leadership that you have in your club activities that really, like, when you boil it down, you're not able to put on paper what exactly you sort of production you've put forth. Also, as we go towards looking at next summer, Jim mentioned, like, if you've taken the algebra 2/geometry level math, you'll be doing some prep, but that all doesn't mean that that's all you can focus on, right? Like, think about some things you can do in your summer to make it productive. But if your students going to camp, that's completely okay. They need to make sure that they spend time with their friends and they hang out and watch TV, play video games, whatever the case may be. We're not saying inundate your student with a lot of activities in there that whole summer, but at the same time, it's when you can maybe dabble in an extra course if you're interested in, or do some extra community service work a couple of days a week, right? So you can kind of get involved and start to get that ball rolling with potential activities that will provide more depth in their junior and senior year. As part of these activities, and a lot of times this is through sports, club sports, through organizations that go to competitions, so DECA, which is business, Model UN, things like that, your student might find themselves on a college campus. You don't need to start doing college visits at the start of your sophomore year. But if your student does find themselves on a college campus, they should start to take note of whether they like the environment, right? If it's a big rah-rah school, do they like that sort of, hey, we're in big classrooms because we're debating, our Model UN assemblies are big, right? Or at the same time, is a club, are the sports facilities what they want, right? So as they go to these schools, even if they're the ones that they're not interested due to location, academics, whatever other factors, they can try to figure out what they like and what they don't like. So once they get to their own college visits, they can start to look for those things. They can start to ask about those things. For parents who, if you have sophomores and you also might have a junior as well, try to bring the sophomore along to the college trip, right? Again, it's the same idea of think of them as practice runs for the sophomore of their actual college visits. Especially if you're going further, you might be able to knock two students out at once, but at the same time, like, if they're just going through a couple of the local ones and figuring out what they like and don't like, that can make the actual trip planning, the college research process a lot easier as they get into kind of their junior year. Fundamentally, there will always be academic matches for your students. The students are looking for a home, which is why we're saying, like, when you get there, look at all those other factors, the vibe of the school, the environment of the school, right? You can look into the academics for the most part and the availability, the class sizes, all that stuff online, the research opportunities available, all of that's online. But figuring out where your student truly feels at home, weather, environment, locale, that sort of thing is going to be most important, because the students who are going to do well in college are going to be happy, are the ones that are happy where they're living, where they are at in college. So with that in mind, like, give them the mindset if they're choosing a home, and we'll figure out the academic matches later, because there's going to be a ton of academic matches for your students.
Well said. Yeah, as our colleague Alyssa likes to say, if you're interested in aeronautical engineering or marine biology, we already know your college list, but for the vast majority of majors, they're offered most anywhere. So, you will find good academic fits in most places, and it's a matter of being happy for 4 years. Good. So we wanted to talk through an end of 10th grade checklist. Obviously, 10th grade either starts next week or already has. So this is not to, put the pressure on, but just to start the year thinking about what do you want to have done by the time we finish this year. Number one is focus on doing as well as you can in your coursework between now and the end of the year. You want to make sure that, you're maximizing your performance, because that's going to be the most significant thing for colleges. Number two is to form a plan for your SAT or ACT test prep. That doesn't mean, take the SAT or ACT officially. It doesn't mean do all your test prep now. It means think about when you're going to talk to, if you're going to work with a company, talk as a family, if we're going to be, working solo, things like that. Identify the extracurricular interests that you want to pursue with more depth. The early 2 years of high school, freshman and sophomore years, we often frame them as exploratory years. You want to find the extracurricular activities that you really care about. And the later years of high school are about building depth in those activities. And then finally, make good informed course selection decisions that are going to set you up for success next year. We already talked about that, so I won't rehash it too much. At this point, thanks everyone so much for joining us, and we'll open it up to the Q&A portion of the evening. All right. So we've got one question in here. How does a student decide if ACT is better for them or SAT? I would assume this one came in, excuse me, before I got to the slides about diagnostic testing, but the best way to do so is to try both tests, compare the scores, and then if the scores, tell the story, as in one is much stronger than the other, your answer is pretty clear. If the scores are closer together, then that's when it could make sense to talk to someone like me about, where are the strengths and weaknesses here, or to make a decision based on which test dates work better for you, which format of test was more comfortable, and things like that. All right. Any other questions coming in? I will start with one that comes in fairly often, which is, how does the timeline change if you're an athletic recruit? Karan, could you take that one?
Yeah, so for a lot of students who athletics are going to be a part of their college admissions process, right? It really depends on what level they're at in terms of their athleticism. So the first thing that every student should do is just talk to their club coaches, their trainers, to figure out, to get an honest assessment of their abilities, right? Are you going to be looking at a D1 school where you may potentially be getting a scholarship to a D3, or are you looking more of like a D3 school where the athletics might help you get into a school, but at the same time, like it's not going to be associated with a scholarship, right? So get athletic assessments about where your student is. But with that being said, start to reach out to coaches and show your interest at the end of this year, right? And so that you get an idea later on of whether the school is interested in you as a potential prospect for that school. A lot of the times the coaches may be even able to provide you kind of a GPA and a test score number that you need to hit, at which point they'll be able to guarantee you admission to a particular school. Right now, a lot of this is contingent on making sure the student stays healthy throughout their athletic career, and making sure they're healthy by the time they're still applying as well. But this gives students more definitive goals to hit for an SAT or an ACT score. They know what sort of GPA they need to have for a particular school. So start to reach out to the coaches at colleges that you're interested in early on, to make sure, one, that there's a mutual interest there, but then also to get a little more guidance on what they're looking for academically for you. Oftentimes at the same school, the better the athletic recruit, the more lax the academic standards are, because that's more likely this coach wants them on the team, right? And so they might, one student might get one GPA number, another student might get another GPA number, right? Same with test scores. A lot of times students will retest even on SATs and ACTs closer to the end of senior year. So their final official score that the school counts in terms of their calculations is higher. And at this point, this is often a year and a half after you've taken your first score that you needed to get. If you're already into the school, but they just needed to help the overall average. So maybe next year they can knock a couple student points off of future students' SAT or ACT score.
Great. Next question. Do you have specialists on your team who can help advise on how to find the best opportunities if you have a talented student, let's say in music or performing arts? Karan?
Yeah, so on the advice, it comes down to, if we're talking about particular theaters or particular troops or things like that, that's not the level of research we have in terms of a student who's kind of more in the arts. What we do have conversations about, and this is a big part of our advising meetings, is how to pursue those interests, right? If the student's showcasing that talent, but all maybe the school has is one or two plays a year, we can talk to you about the potential opportunities that may be in your area in terms of camps, in terms of theater programs, and what sort of research we can walk you through, what sort of research you need to do for your student to figure out what right opportunities are correct for them, right? So in terms of saying joining this exact exact troupe or joining this exact singing choir. It won't be that, but it'll be more giving you a blueprint of how to figure out what is the right opportunity, how to pursue those opportunities, and how to kind of balance them and figure out which ones are the right for you, is what our advising would do, not only for students who are interested in the arts, but STEM, athletics, any discipline.
Yeah, and I would add to that, shoot us an email with a little more detail about the situation to info@myivexperience.com. If it's in our wheelhouse to help, we will tell you. And if not, we'll let you know that too. We can also, we have a fairly wide network of professionals in this space. And so we can ask around to some people we know to see, do you have a contact who does specifically specialize a little more tightly, if that's what you're looking for.
And just one more thing specifically of the arts that I forgot to mention is that we do have a portfolio consultant on our team. And so what he does is, as part for students who are interested in the arts and might be applying to schools that are looking at their performance aspects as well, or their art aspects as well, in terms of what the students created, whether it be film, photography, etc. The portfolio consultant's a former admissions officer at Pratt, and what he does is he goes through the students' work, or if they don't have all the work that they would need for a solid portfolio yet, to talk them through how to get set up for that proper portfolio, talk to them about like what pieces to pick, that sort of thing. So we do have that expertise when you get to kind of the application side.
That's right. And that's even for things like architecture, sculpture, film, any kind of program that would require a portfolio, of which performing arts is going to be only one. Awesome. It looks like we've addressed all the questions. If you have more individual questions, always feel free to shoot us an email. If we can help, we will. If it's, if the answer's a 2-minute email, we'll send back a 2-minute email. If we think, it's best addressed by one of our services, we'll point you to the right place. So feel free, if you're interested in learning more about how we can help you, also to book a free 15-minute call with me using that link. There's no charge for that. We just talk through kind of where you are in the process and how we can help. Thanks everybody for your time tonight. It was a pleasure, and good luck with the school year.
Have a good night.